Hello, everyone out there. Thank you for joining us on a sunny Memorial Day. For those of you that are taking the time to tune in live, we appreciate you joining us. I also just want to take a minute quick, if you're joining us for the first time, to talk about some of the other programs that the museum is doing. This Wednesday, we have a great program with the Factory LLC, which is a new startup company right near the museum. They're talking about how they take small businesses and grow them with manufacturing and marketing. And we're so happy that they'll be able to join us. And then next Tuesday, Martha Capel Fox from the National Canal Museum and the D&L Heritage Trail is joining us again, and she's going to be talking about silk mills in the Lehigh Valley. And we also have a lot of great kids programming, from virtual story time to quotes and quests to live Tinker Time programs. So if you've got kids or you're a grandparent, have your grandkids tune in. We've got a lot of great programming for the little ones too, as well as the adults. We've got a lot more history coming up in the next couple weeks. Again, if you're joining us live, thanks again for joining us. This is now our 19th live lecture program, so we're so happy to be able to continue this. And if you're watching this, you know that it's free, and we ask you that if you're able to consider supporting the museum right now, whether you're buying a membership, making a donation, or if you're shopping at Amazon at home, you can use Amazon Smile and select NMIH as your charity of choice, and we'll get part of your purchase donated towards the museum. If you have any questions throughout this presentation, please ask them in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Joining us today, and a very timely topic for Memorial Day, is Professor John Smith from Lehigh University. He's going to be talking about Bethlehem Steel and its role in World War I. Professor Smith trained as both an engineer and historian, and he specializes in the history of technology and business history. His research interests focus on the history of industrial research and development and the chemical industry. He received his Ph.D. from the University of Delaware, and he's an associate professor in the Department of History at Lehigh University. Professor Smith, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Glenn, and thank the museum for allowing me to talk today.
Thank you. All right, everyone, enjoy.
All right, so today we're going to talk about Bethlehem Steel and their role in World War I. The first thing I want to talk is, how did Bethlehem Steel get in the armaments business in the first place? In front of you is a slide of the Bethlehem Steel exhibit from the 1904 World's Fair. And what you see here is that there are all kinds. There's ammunition, there's very large battleship guns, there are pieces of armor plate. How did Bethlehem get involved in this? Because this company was originally founded in the 1860s to make rails for Asa Packers railroads. But by the late 1870s, the steel industry was moving west to Pittsburgh. Andrew Carnegie was getting in the rail business, and the future did not look very bright for Bethlehem Steel. But after the death of Asa Packer in 1879, several other members of the board, primarily Joseph Wharton, decided that perhaps Bethlehem could get into a new business by helping the United States build a modern Navy. After the 1870s, with new developments in steelmaking, it became possible to build very large ships made out of steel with very large guns. In fact, it was seen that these were kind of the ultimate weapons of the time, the main expression of national power. In the late 19th century, Germany and Britain got involved in a naval arms race, which heightened nationalism in both countries and helped contribute to the tensions which led to World War I. The United States, watching what was going on in Europe, decided that we needed to have a modern Navy too. And whereas we did not have the technology to build that Navy, Bethlehem Steel bid on the contract and was able to get the contract. And of course, one of the things that they were able to do was to make very large pieces of armor plate. Here we see a gun turret for the battleship, the Alabama. One of the interesting things I found about these pictures is, this is a staged picture. It took somebody some time and energy to do this nice writing on the turret, and they put a proud workman here to show what Bethlehem was doing. Of course, one of the most iconic Bethlehem Steel pictures, and maybe you'll see this in lots of places, was the machine shop number 2, the very long, what, 1/3 of a mile long building right across the street now from the outlets, which is where battleship guns were made. In fact, in the foreground, you can see a battleship gun. Over 700 people worked in this shop. It would be amazing. I only wish that there were some motion picture films. It must have been an incredible sight to see this facility in action. But in any way, this is a remarkable picture. And of course, World War I was a war that nobody really expected, nobody anticipated. It kind of happened maybe like a lot of wars. It happened with a lot of accidents, a lot of incidents that, as I said, no one really planned for. But what turned out that was new about World War I was the level of casualties. Technology in the late 19th century had advanced. The military leadership had not really paid a lot of attention to this technology. Traditionally, the military leaders thought that there were two things that mattered. One was leadership, and the second one was the quality of soldiers. Ironically, the Europeans came and they watched the American Civil War, where you could foreshadow what was going to happen in World War I, even with the more primitive weapons of that period. But ironically, instead of going back to Europe impressed with the role that technology could play in modern wars, the Europeans once again said that the American generals were lousy and the American soldiers were poorly trained. But what happened in World War I was what no one anticipated, a war of stalemate, where technology, the big guns, the machine guns, just created incredible numbers of casualties. These are some statistics I found on the internet. The casualties are just astounding. A total of 8.5 million soldiers killed in this war, 21 million wounded, 7 million prisoners and missing. Of course, the one thing you can notice from this chart is how light American casualties are. And I just want to point out on this Memorial Day, when we remember the sacrifices that Americans have made in America's wars. But one of the things is good about our country is that we've had fewer casualties in wars than probably most other large countries in the world. In part, this is because of the wisdom of our founding fathers, who in the Constitution gave the power to make war to Congress. Congress has only declared war 5 times. The first 3 wars were mainly wars of territory. In 1812, we tried to steal Canada from Britain. In the Mexican War, we took Texas and California. And in the Spanish-American War, we took parts of the Spanish Empire. Our motives for getting into World War I were more complex, and World War II turned out to be just the second phase of World War I. So we should, it's sad that so many Americans have died, but given our, I think, intelligent political leadership over times, we have not shared the level of casualties of other nations. Yeah, here data reflect. Here is a post-World War I picture of a American soldier with a pile of boots, I guess collected from the battlefield. And there he is thinking about and remembering those of his comrades who did not survive the war. And of course, what we know about World War I is that Germany had planned a lightning strike and capture Paris, as they'd done in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. The Germans made it to within 50 miles of Paris, but the British and the French stopped them. And then what we saw was 4 years of very little movement. There was just no offense. Neither side could gain much territory. And when they did, The British in 1916 were going to have a major push along the Somme River. And then one of the most remarkable battles in history, on the very first day, the British suffered 57,470 casualties. The British had thought that their shelling of the German lines would have weakened the Germans. The Germans had dug in under the ground. And then when the British marched across the field, the German machine gunners mowed them down. In fact, the German machine gunners could not understand why the British were committing suicide. And over the months of the battle between July and November, the British suffered 420,000 casualties, and the Germans suffered 500,000. This scale of casualties had just never been seen in war before. And of course, what we know about World War I, and recently, World War I has really come back into attention with two movies in the last couple of years. The remarkable movie using real World War I films set into a modern cinematic program, They Shall Not Grow Old. And then last year, 1917, has demonstrated once again the misery of soldiers in World War I, spending their time dug into trenches, waiting for the orders to go over the top and to attack the other side. Life on the front lines, you can see here a French hospital with a lot of sandbags over here to protect from the incoming shells. Here's another photo showing what life was like on the front lines. Again, people dug into the earth in order to protect themselves from the constant shelling. Though I must say, life in the trenches, life did go on in the trenches. This is from a remarkable set of postcards that I bought at a flea market where the Salvation Army sent women to the front lines to make donuts for the soldiers. And here we see in this photograph, Salvation Army making donuts under bombardment of German guns in France. And here we see the grateful American soldiers getting their fresh homemade donuts made by the Salvation Army. The cause of much of when we think about World War I, a lot of times we think of the machine gun, but the real technology that dominated the war was the artillery shell, the big guns. A British study after the war estimated that 2/3 of the casualties in the war had been caused by the shelling. And what we see here is a shell, and I like it standing here next to the soldier. You can see the size of this thing. This is actually a naval shell. This is a 16-inch armor-piercing shell. And one of the interesting things, a innovation in World War I, is it has about 100 pounds of TNT in the shell. TNT was a new development in World War I. It was an explosive chemical that when the shell hit something, it would then explode and then send shell fragments everywhere. You can see the total weight of the shell is 2,900 pounds. And this thing could travel 20 miles fired from a battleship gun. And the other important aspect here is the amount of powder it took. 650 pounds of smokeless powder in order to fire this thing. And these are bags of smokeless powder that would be loaded into the cannon in order to fire the shell. One of the interesting features of this is that these bags were made out of silk, which was kind of an expensive material to just blow up. But they discovered that silk did not give a muzzle flash. Because if you had a muzzle flash, you would give away your position and the enemy would know where your gun was. And of course, during World War I, Bethlehem Steel made many of these shells, and the DuPont company made most of the smokeless powder, and both companies benefiting very greatly from the war. And of course, the big guns. The big guns, some of them so big they could be only mounted on rail cars, made shelling a constant. The guns fired all the time. The shelling went on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Here's a picture from the battlefield with the guns right there on the front line, a row of them for firing at the enemy. And of course, when we think of no man's land during World War I, it was the effect of the shelling. I mean, it just wreaked havoc on the countryside, blowing big holes everywhere. And of course, for Bethlehem Steel, the opening of the war provided an opportunity for Bethlehem Steel. By the fall of 1914, Bethlehem Steel had already received $150 million in orders from the Allies. And Bethlehem Steel at this point was still a pretty small company in 1914. The company had been bought and taken over by Charles Schwab in 1905. Schwab had invested quite a bit of money in enlarging the company, but it was still a relatively small company in 1914. And the president of the company at that point was a Lehigh class of 99's Eugene Grace, a very bright and an aggressive young man who had started with the company coming right out of Bethlehem in 1899. And by the time of World War I, had risen to the role of president. And of course, during the war, Bethlehem very quickly began to make munitions for the Allies. Now you have to remember, the war started in August of 1914. The United States did not enter the war until April of 1917. So for the interval, Bethlehem Steel became one of the major providers of munitions to the Allies. And of course, one of the things they had to do was to get the workers to be enthusiastic. They did start a company magazine called the Bethlehem Booster. And here's one of the things about Bethlehem Steel, engaged in the war manufacture, and goes on to explain some of the products that are needed, and encouraging the workers to work hard and to produce for the war effort. Of course, you needed a little downtime, and you need a little recreation. Here's a lunchtime band concert for the workers to have a little amusement when they were taking a break. Of course, one of the really remarkable aspects of the war here was this photograph from the Bethlehem Steel Lebanon plant taken in the fall of 1918. And on their baseball team was a guy named Ruth, Babe Ruth. What in the world was Babe Ruth doing? Babe Ruth had just pitched the Boston Red Sox victory in the World Series of 1918. Of course, it'd take a long time before the Red Sox would win another World Series. But Ruth, there was an order at that point that you either were working or you were going to be drafted into the Army. To avoid being drafted, Ruth joined the Bethlehem Steel plant in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and they promptly put him on their baseball team. Ruth was officially, I guess, a painter, but the war ended. He only stayed a couple months there. When the war ended in November 11th, Babe Ruth disappeared, and apparently he did not even pick up his paycheck. There was also a little bit of coercion. One of the interesting things about the Bethlehem Steel plant is that a large number of the workers in the plant had come from what was then known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we were at war with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So a significant fraction of the workers in the plant were actually citizens of the countries that we were fighting against. Now, I probably not too many of those workers were very sympathetic with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many people from places like Slovenia, Slovakia had come, and Hungary had come to the United States because they were not happy with being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they wanted to have a country for their own ethnic group. But one of the things they did was all the workers were encouraged to donate some of their earnings to the war effort by buying Liberty bonds. But here's a picture of this boob hung from the flagpole, did not participate in the Liberty bonds. One of the interesting things Bethlehem Steel did was they hired this fellow, Julian Grove, to Americanize their workers. He would come and give talks about, what it meant to be in America, why America was fighting, and to basically ensure that the workers remain loyal to the United States. There was in 1915 a fire in what was called Machine Shop Number 4, which destroyed it. There was a lot of concern at that point about German sabotage, whether there had been unloyal workers or German saboteurs who had done this, but it was never really discovered whether it was an accident or whether it was actually an act of sabotage. For the foreign workers, many of whom were not very proficient in English, Bethlehem Steel came up with a quite simple thing for them. Hooray, hooray, USA, USA, hooray, hooray, USA, USA, Bethlehem Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Bethlehem Steel. All right, so Bethlehem is in the munitions business. And as I pointed out, the mass production of guns and shells led to an unprecedented level of violence that could be rained on soldiers in this war. Here is a chart which shows the expenditure of artillery ammunition in modern battles. You can see at the Battle of Gettysburg, which lasted 3 days, the Union fired 32,781 artillery shells. Now, what really stands out, of course, you can see in this chart, is the Battle of the Somme. What the British did was, in the matter of a week, they fired 4 million shells at the German lines. Now, the total front there was about 25 miles wide. And I calculated that means the Germans, the British fired about 10 shells per every foot of that front. And of course, their idea was that this shelling was going to decimate the Germans, and then the British were going to march through the hole in the German lines. And as I pointed out earlier, the shelling was largely ineffective. The German line was intact, and the British marched into a horrible maelstrom of shells and machine guns. To continue this, as the war escalated, the amount of artillery shells consumed in the war just went on and up and up and up. You can see that by 1918, that the British and the French fired 12.7 million artillery shells in 1 month. And if you look at the lower part of this, in 1918, the British and the French combined could produce 150 million artillery shells per year. I mean, this was truly an incredible triumph of modern industrial technology. And of course, many, many of these shells that were fired had been made in Bethlehem. This again is, I see as one of the most iconic photographs of that Bethlehem Steel took. This is a Picture of a plant that was used to take roughly forged artillery shells on the left, the shiny silver things, and on the right there are banks of lathes that were used to machine those shells down to tolerance. Now, one of the remarkable things about World War I is that all those tens of millions of shells that were fired in the war were handmade. It just seems inconceivable, but they were. Every shell was hand forged and cut to specification on lathes, which you can see those large banks of lathes. Now, the interesting thing, company magazine, the Bethlehem Booster, is that here we are in the middle of a war, and they took the time to clean up the shop. It's beautiful. It's spotless. Somebody had to hang all those flags in there, and it's truly a remarkable photograph. So, how do you mass produce millions of shells? Well, the first thing you have to do is pour the molten steel into a mold. Here's a picture of pouring the molten steel into one of thousands and thousands of molds. Then, each shell had to be forged. This is a hydraulic press, and what we see here is a number of workers while they are pressing the molded shell into the appropriate shape. And then, like I pointed out before, these shells had to be cut to specification. And here we see a bank of lathes, all with shells on it to be cut to the proper specs. And to the right, you can see a conveyor belt, which is bringing the shells in and probably taking the shells out after they've been cut. Of course, where are you going to get all these workers? A lot of the young men had gone off to war. One of the interesting things Bethlehem Steel did is it did not encourage its foreign workers to become citizens during the war, because if they became citizens, they would be subject to the draft. And Bethlehem wanted to keep its employees. One of the interesting things, too, is that there really wasn't any retirement back then. Here we see a picture of Mr. William Buck, who is 70 years young and resides with his wife and 2 children at 229 5th Street, South Bethlehem. So they used older workers. And also, they used women. Here we see a number of women who are training. They use the women as lathe operators. What we see in this picture is women being trained to operate a lathe. So many of those shells were cut to spec by women. Another facility that Bethlehem Steel had about 5 or 6 miles east of Bethlehem, it was a little settlement called Reddington on the Lehigh River. Out there, Bethlehem built a very large ammunition assembly plant, almost completely with female employees. Here we see a picture of a woman loading smokeless powder into a rifle shell. One of the interesting things about these plants is that these women were working with the high explosives. TNT actually had to be melted before it could be poured into a shell. It was pretty dangerous work. But at Bethlehem Steel, I did not really have any real major accidents at the Reddington plant. This is where I always make a joke about here a number of Lehigh students trying to figure out which end of the gun that the shell comes out of. But this is actually a group of soldier trainees. The Army set up a training facility at Lehigh University. And here we see these were not students. These were soldiers who were brought to Lehigh for training. And here we see them down at Bethlehem Steel learning how to take guns apart, put them back together, and service them. Okay, the other important aspect of World War I, of course, was shipping. The Germans unleashed their U-boats in World War I. The U-boats had a devastating effect on Allied shipping. Of course, the Americans, we were keeping the British and the French and the Russians in the war with our supplies, munitions that we were sending to Europe. But the Germans were taking a big toll with their U-boats. They started the war with only about 13 U-boats, but each of those U-boats was sinking about 40 Allied ships a month. In fact, the Germans were really sinking ships faster than we could build them. Well, Bethlehem Steel, Charles Schwab, who was the chairman of the board of Bethlehem Steel, had always been interested in shipbuilding. And in and here we have, I don't know, fun thing about Bethlehem building ships. Well, this is actually the armor plate department, but I love this. I guess Bethlehem has always loved parades. And I love this photograph from a Bethlehem parade. And I particularly admire the guy who got to be the gun turret and have the battleship guns on his head. The guys who have smokestacks on their head, maybe not the best job either. But just a slide to talk about Bethlehem and being into shipbuilding. Yeah, in 1916, in the middle of the war, Schwab was able to buy a large steel mill, the Sparrows Point Steel Mill east of Baltimore, and with it came a large shipyard. And right before the war, in 1913, Schwab had bought the Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts. So during the war, Bethlehem Steel had two very large shipyards, and they were able to make a lot of ships for the war effort. In 1918, President Wilson, seen here, asked Schwab if he would take over the construction of all the ships for the American war effort. And here we see Wilson and Schwab with a couple of steel workers. Schwab took the job and did a good job of allowing America to make enough ships that we could keep the Allies in the war and not let the U-boats completely cut off Britain and France from the United States. The Bethlehem Public Library has a rather nice collection of war posters. World War I really represented sort of the employment of the graphic arts in support of the war effort. Both the Allies and the Axis powers, they all used posters. They used posters in factories, they used posters on streets in order to get people to support the war effort. And here's one of the posters. The thing that Schwab was made head of was the Emergency Fleet Corporation. And this one says, "Are you working with Schwab?" And here we see Schwab watching some steel workers. Some of these posters are really spectacular. Here we see "On the Job for Victory," the United States Shipping Board Emergency Fleet Corporation. "Nothing stops these men, let nothing stop you." When you're building a ship in the shipyard, you're just as important to the war effort as the men on the front lines. And then this one, this is perhaps my favorite. An enraged American eagle, "The ships are coming." Really spectacular artwork in support of the war effort. "Your work means victory, build another one." And "Rivets or bayonets, drive them home." Again, trying to exhort workers on the home front to do their best in their jobs. "Make every minute count for Pershing." All right, just given where we are right now with the COVID virus, of course, the terrible, what was called the Spanish flu, hit Bethlehem in the middle of October 1918. Because of the importance of the American of the Bethlehem plant to the American war effort, everything in Bethlehem was shut down but the plant. Bethlehem was more or less under martial law, and here we see some of the medical personnel involved in the effort, and Bethlehem's case rate and Bethlehem's casualty rate were far below what would have been expected for a city of Bethlehem size. And what's really kind of interesting is that flu, basically they used herd indemnity or immunity. It came and went in 3 weeks. Probably most people caught it, and you either got it or you got better. Then what's interesting, on November 11th, when the war ended, people ran out into the streets and they hugged and kissed everybody. The flu had been in Bethlehem only a few weeks earlier, and people were worried that there would be a second wave. But fortunately, that did not happen. The celebrations did not lead to another wave. Okay, so what did the war do for Bethlehem Steel? Well, as I said, in 1913, Bethlehem Steel was a moderate size steel company, tiny compared to the giant behemoth U.S. Steel, which at that point controlled over half of America's steel production. But what we can see is that during the war, Bethlehem had $300 million of sales to the Allies. And they were able to charge the Allies rather high prices because the Allies were desperate. From 1913 to 1918, Bethlehem Steel sales went up by a factor of 7, and their profits went up by a factor of 12. 1916 was truly the best year in the history of the Bethlehem Steel Company. On total sales of $217 million, the company cleared $47 million in income, roughly 20% return on sales, and of course there were no taxes on any of that money. 1917 was also a good year. Profits declined in 1918, even though sales blossomed to $452 million, because when the United States got in the war, the United States government was not going to pay the same high prices that were charged to the Allies. And one of the interesting things here too is, where did the Allies get the money? Well, they got the money from J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan lent the money to the Allies, who used that money to buy Bethlehem munitions. After the war, the Europeans had a $2 billion debt to the United States, and the United States insisted that that debt be paid. And paying off that debt was one of the factors that led to economic insecurity in Europe, and was one of the factors precipitating World War II. But at the end of the war, Bethlehem's total assets had increased from 85 to $400 million, 500 times. And at that point, Bethlehem, in terms of assets, was the third largest company in the United States. 1/3 the size of U.S. Steel and 1/2 the size of Standard Oil. The war really, truly brought Bethlehem onto the national scene. And then in the years after the war, Bethlehem would use a lot of that money in order to buy a number of other steel companies, allowing them to become half the size of U.S. Steel, a size that they pretty much maintained throughout much of the 20th century. Okay, just in conclusion here, I did want to mention another Lehigh Valley company in the war, and that was Mack Trucks. The United States, Mack, from Allentown began to supply Mack trucks to the British Army. The British were so impressed with them that they called them bulldogs because they admired their tenacity, a name that stuck. And during the war, Mack also did very well by producing thousands of trucks that were used for the U.S. military. Well, that's pretty much what I had to say today. So now I'm gonna take us back to Glenn and see what if anyone had any responses.
Thank you so much. I think one of the only questions that we had while you were presenting, and I think you answered it, was the shells were just manufactured at Bethlehem and filled with explosives elsewhere. That's correct?
The explosives were made mainly by DuPont.
Gotcha.
So, and if there's DuPont did $450 million of business with the Allies, and Bethlehem was second with $300 million.
Interesting. I'll just give it a second to see if any other questions come in. But one of the things that we were talking about before we went live here is that the armor bending press, which is outside of the Wind Creek Casino, was built prior to World War I and produced a lot of the naval armor for these ships. And if anybody's seen the news a little while ago, that press is actually going to be moving at some point. We're hoping to be bringing it to the museum. So that's kind of an interesting thing that ties in with this. That'll be quite the spectacle if everything goes well. Another question.
I don't know.
Go ahead.
I don't know how many of those hydraulic presses they had, because you saw I had that one picture showing them forging a shell with a hydraulic press.
Yeah, I have a few photos. There was one of the shops that press was in, the one that we're getting. I think there was 2 or 3 presses in there at one point. One was larger, but that was scrapped, I think, in the Korean War or the Vietnam War. They got rid of it. But this one was in operation pretty late in the game, right up until the end of production at Bethlehem Steel. So it was in operation for over 100 years, which is kind of wild when you think about it. One question came in, and someone asked if the Grace Mines in Morgantown were named for Eugene Grace.
Yes.
I think that was all the questions that we had. So thank you so much, Professor Smith, for joining us.
Okay.
And we really appreciate your knowledge and the timely topic for Memorial Day.
Okay.
And thank you everybody that watched at home. Again, if you want to check out this recording later, if you tuned in a little late, you'll be able to catch it here on Facebook. You'll be able to replay it, or if you go to our website at noah.org, you'll be able to see the recording there via YouTube. And again, stay tuned for a lot of other programming that we have coming up in the next couple weeks. We have the Factory LLC, which is a Bethlehem company, and we have a presentation on Pennsylvania silk mills coming up. So stay tuned for more programming, and we appreciate everybody for joining us. And thanks again, Professor Smith.
All right. Thank you.